And we're back, and you are probably wondering, how did I get this picture in the background, and what does that actually mean? We're now going to talk about the topic of realistic lighting, or realistic exposure of our scene. So what is the difference between realistic exposure and a non-realistic exposure? Well, this what you see right now is a very realistic exposure, and here's the counterexample. It's nice too, don't get me wrong, and that's what you often see in product animation, this beautiful softbox lighting, and it comes directly from Blender, but as I said, it's not realistic. So if you want a realistic render, what do we do? Well, we can start working with so-called HDRIs. HDRI stands for High Dynamic Range Imagery. If an HDRI appears as a panorama, then you can use that in Blender to set that as the scene background and thus allow a realistic exposure to take place. You may remember that when we first looked at the material preview, I also said that there are now different background exposures, so to speak. These are all stock HDRIs here. That means if we change that now, we see the exposure on our objects change as well. So how can I find HDRIs from the internet and then put them in Blender? Well, on the subject of that, you can go to a website called polyheaven.com, and here you can simply click on HDRI, and then you have all possible HDRIs right in front of your nose. You can then simply click download, and you can also select the resolution. 4K usually is more than enough for what we're going to be doing, and then you can save the HDRI on your computer. This is a panorama texture. This could be seen from the fact that it is stretched at the top and the bottom, and that the right and the left connect to each other, so to speak. And we can now integrate this in Blender as follows. If we go into the shader editor again, we can see that next to the shader editor symbol, there's this option where object is, and we can change that to world. And then there's also line style, but we'll talk about that later at the very end of this course. Anyway, let's click on world now because we want to change the environment. Now, here we can already see that there's a background node and that the world output node are set up by default. So for reference, if you switch to object, you see that there's a material output node, and the moment you switch back to world, you have a world output node. That's the big difference. Now, there are two inputs for the world output, surface and volume. This means that we can now even insert a volume shader into the volume here. Now, if I would put a light in here now, you can see that this volumetric scattering of our entire scene is basically everywhere. It's only just a very short demonstration. We'll look into this later when we go into the rendering of scenes where everything is supposed to look a bit dark and stuff like that, but we don't need this function right now at this moment. And we're now going to look on how to adjust the exposure of our world's surface. So for this, we leave the background node as it is now, we press Shift A, and we search for the environment texture. Now we put the color in there, and then you will see that it's pink. It's just very pink, and pink means that there is no texture, and that makes sense because we didn't pick one yet. So here we go, we open the Belfast Sunset 4K.EXR, and this is the texture we just downloaded, and now you will see that this panorama texture lights up your objects in the scene, so to speak. Our mug and our table are placed within this landscape, and that's the absolute best way if you want to create realistic renders. When you work with HDRIs, you will immediately be able to achieve a much more realistic result. And that's why I'm telling you right now, make sure you start working with HDRIs, and make sure you don't get the idea of saying, I want a sunset, so I'll just put a sun lamp in here, rotate the sun lamp, and then move it down a little bit because the sun is crooked, and then I put the color to yellow. I mean, I'm just doing this as a brief demonstration. I mean, it might not look bad, but as you can see, it lacks light from the background. There's no light at all coming from anywhere, and that's why the shadow is completely black and just entirely unrealistic. Long story short, if you want a sunset exposure, it's much easier to just download an HDRI from the internet. Theoretically, we could also remove the background here in between and just put the color directly into the output, but the reason we don't do that is because we don't have any control over how strong it will be. Because here with the strength parameter, we can now continue to make adjustments. Okay, but what if I don't like where the light is coming from? Do I have to press A, R, and Z to rotate our objects? Or can we also rotate the HDRI around our object? Yes, you can. If you enable the node wrangler, which I told you about earlier, then you can select the HDRI texture, press Ctrl T, and then these two nodes will be automatically created for you. And now you can basically input a certain value for the Z-axis, and then you can move your background around your scene. It's quite convenient. Okay, that's all fine and dandy, but what if I want to make my own HDRIs? I mean, it's nice that I can get a Belfast sunset online, but what if I want to record an HDRI in my home country? Is that possible? Can I do that without spending 4,000 euros on a special camera? Yes, you can. And you can even use your own cell phone, and that's the cool part. And I'm going to show you that in the next lecture, like how you do it and how you can then integrate the whole thing into Blender and how you can actually implement it super practically and super clean. So stay tuned, we're gonna be looking into that in the next lesson.